In this video, we're going to cover the Prepare the Data section in the DA-100 exam, specifically how you can clean and transform your data using Power Query within Power BI. So without further ado, let's get started. Hi, my name is Fernan and welcome to the Solutions Abroad YouTube channel where I focus on teaching beginners the wonderful world that is Power BI. I upload new videos every week, so make sure you hit that subscribe button and the bell icon to get notified when a new one is out. In my previous video where we cover how you profile your data using Power Query, we focused more on how you can check your column distribution, your column validity to check if you have any errors or issues, but we didn't really focus much on the transformation part. So we'll go through that part now in a little bit more in depth. So let's look at this demo that I prepared for you today. So for those of you who didn't watch my previous video, we're going to start with a blank report here. So we'll start by getting the data here. So we have an employee's data that we used previously, and at the beginning we loaded the data. So when you first load this data, you will get an error because we have some issues within the dataset itself that we need to resolve in Power Query. So let's go to View Errors and let's open it in Power Query. So here we'll see that on our column distribution, we'll see that the error is in the date of birth. So we already know that. So let's remove this this query that Power BI generated for us. We don't really need it anymore, and let's focus on the query itself. Again, when we profiled our data, we also knew that we can use the profile of all of the data that we have in this table so we can see where the problems are. So first, we know that the date of birth column has an issue. So one of the columns it's not date. So to fix that, we can do it through here. So if we hover over it, we'll have the option to remove errors. It will do the same thing as if you just right click on the column, and you can actually remove errors from here too. So it will do the same thing. When I hit the remove error button, you will see that on the applied steps here, it adds a new step for us. And every time you add a new transformation in Power Query, it adds a new step in this applied step. So it's kind of like a history of all of the transformations that you make. And with these applied steps, if you wanted to see how the data looked like before you made those changes, you can always go back up. So for example, if you want to see the data before we applied the removed error step, you'll see that we still have the error there. And then if we go back one more step, you'll see that our columns won't have the right types yet, because that gets done on the next step where we change the types. And when we go back up here, you'll see that the column headers are not fixed yet. So that's chronological order from top to bottom. But for now, let's leave the table as it is and let's hit close and apply. This loads the table that we created into the Power BI dataset. Now, because we added that step to remove the error on our query, when we loaded this data, it didn't show the error anymore. So that should be okay for now. And from here, we can actually start visualizing our data. So let's try to do that. Let's bring in the ID, the name and date of birth. And let's just put them in a table for now, just to show exactly what we have here. Let's move the ID and let's stop the summarize just so that it doesn't add it all up, and let's sort it by ID for now. Now we have some basic employee data here in our data set. But for example, if we wanted to add a new dimension to this, so let's say we want to split it by department, we'll need to load it as a separate query or as a separate table within the same data set. So I've already prepared a department table here. So if I do a get data again, and in this case, let's look for department, hit open. You'll see that we have some data here which has ID, which corresponds to the employee ID on the employees table that we have, and to which department they belong to. Let's transform this data and bring it up in the Power Query window. So from this view, we can see that for each employee, there is a corresponding department that they belong to. Let's close and apply this for now, and let's load this into the dataset. So now you'll see that a new table has been added into our field section on the right hand side, which has the ID and department. If we look at the data view, it's exactly as we have on the CSV file, and we have the employees as well. Under the model view is where we will be looking at how these two would be related. Now at the moment you can see a connection between the department and the employees, which Power BI automatically generates for you. You can disable this feature in the future, but at the moment what Power BI does is it tries to understand the relationship between tables as you load them. And at the moment it's figured out a connection between the department and the employees table. If we hover over the link or the relationship, you can see that it made a connection between the ID on the department and the employee. So it understood that there is a connection that you can use between these two. These fields that we're using, the IDs, are what we call keys, primary keys and foreign keys in a relational diagram. In this case, we have the ID as the primary key for employees, and the department would be the foreign key, which is what links the department to the employees. Another thing you want to look at is the relationship itself. So you can see that there is a number and there's an asterisk in between those two. So that denotes the kind of relationship that you have here at the moment. So it's detected that there is a one-to-many relationship between these two. So basically they're saying that for every one item in the department, there is a multiple equivalent in the employees. Let's modify this into a one-to-one relationship, because we expect this to be a one ID on department equals to one ID in the employees table. So if we double click on this, it will show you the relationship, and it shows you how these two tables are related. We can change the cardinality to 1-to-1, and then you'll see that it shows us an error. It shows us that the cardinality you selected isn't valid for this relationship. But why? Now, if you watch my previous video, you'll know that actually we missed out one step on the employees. So in the employees table, we have some IDs that are duplicated. So that means if you use a column that isn't a unique column, it will be a many-to-one relationship. So let's fix that first, and then let's modify this relationship. Let's go back to the Power Query. So hit transform window. Let's go to the ID, and this time let's right click and remove duplicates. That removes the duplicates in this column, which makes it unique. We hit close and apply. And let's go back to the relationship properties, and let's try one-to-one this time. That should work. So let's cancel that. Let's delete this relationship, and let's create a new one. So let's drag the ID from the departments and ID on the employees. So now you will see that it creates a one-to-one relationship between these two tables. Now that you've created a relationship between these two tables, you're now able to use these two together in the visualizations view of the report. So let's go back to the report view. And in this time, we have the ID, name and date of birth from the employees table. If we drag the department field, you'll see that it now gives us the value for every employee and which department they belong to. The data is not necessarily in the same table, but Power BI recognizes the relationship through the model view, which is amazing. So now you know a little bit more about the relationships. Let's go back to Power Query and let's explore some of the ways that you can transform your data through it. Let's go back to Power Query using transform data. So you see from here you have a ton of transformation options at your disposal. From the ribbon here, you'll see a ton of options that you can use to transform your data. And also you'll have some more options that won't be visible on that ribbon if you right click on the data itself. So for example, if we right click on the name here, the name column header, you see that you have a lot of options to transform this column itself, the data within this column. So things like replace errors, values. You can transform the names to be uppercase, so let's do that and show you how it looks like. It transforms all the data in there in the name, for example. Let's also, for example, let's say we want to extract just the years from the date of birth. You can also do that here. So if we right click here, you're able to just extract year, just the year, but you can also do other ones as well. So month, quarter, week, day. Let's do year for now, and you'll see that just gives us the years for those date of births instead of the date. You can use Power Query to do things like add a new column, a custom column, for example. Let's say, for example, you want to change the date of births to be a year behind. We can do that by hitting the add column. You have the option to do a conditional column, which probably we won't use right now, but let me just show you quickly. It's pretty simple. So it's a normal if statement. So for example, let's say if the date of birth, if the year is 2020, in 2020, not in 2020. So this creates a custom column as part of this table. So if I hit OK, you'll see that you're able to use other columns, and you can use Power Query to transform your data set into a format that would work for you when you start visualizing your reports. There are so many ways that you can transform your data in Power BI or in Power Query. So the best way for you to learn what they are is by using them. So we won't go through all of them here, but it will most likely, all of them will be in the home or the transform window. And when you right click, you will see all of your options there as well. The great thing about the transformations is that you don't have to worry about your data disappearing because of the applied steps window here, which you can use to travel back in time. And consequently, you can also remove the steps that you didn't want to. So for example, we did a lot of modifications in this data. So let's remove all of those steps and let's go back to the point where we just removed the issues. So let's delete, delete, and delete. So now we went back to the original form of this table without doing those transformation steps. Sometimes when you load data from files or databases, they have names that are not too user-friendly. And you want to give your data meaningful names and tags so that your users are able to use your dataset without having troubles when finding what they want. From here, we have the queries on the left-hand side. You can rename them to something more descriptive. So let's do a rename here. Let's name this employees. So we know that this is an employees table. And let's do the same thing with the department. Same thing with the column headers. At the moment, they are pretty descriptive and pretty basic, but you're also able to rename them to something more standard. Let's say we'll name this ID, our employee ID, which makes more sense. And department here. Let's go back to employees and do the same. Date of birth. The same thing can be done with the applied steps on the query settings window on the right hand side here. Typically they'd be descriptive enough for you to know what's been changed, but normally as this grows and you do more calculations and do more transformations, they can be very vague, sometimes too vague. So you can also rename these to make them a little bit more descriptive. So right click and rename. We'll keep this for now because there isn't really much we can add to this detail, but you also have that option to rename steps if you need. If you look back to the column headers here, you'll see that the column types are denoted by the figures on the column headers themselves. So we can see it's a date here, and this is a text, and this is a number. This normally gets automatically generated by Power BI when you first load your data, but you can change this if you just click on them, and you'll have the option to change this to something else. So for example, we didn't want the employee ID to be numbers. We can change this to a text, and we can do the same thing with the department. text. So before, we looked at how we can use the relationships in the model view to create a relationship between the departments table and the employees table. Well, in Power Query, you can achieve the same thing by combining the department table and the employees together. In Power Query, there are two ways that you can combine your data. You use merge or append. Let me show you how you can use the merge to combine these two tables together. So let's go back to our employees query here, and under home, let's click merge queries. This lets us combine the employees and department as long as we know what to connect them with. So let's select department here, and between these two tables we know that they are connected through the employee ID. So we'll connect these two and we'll hit OK. Let's expand now this department that we brought in. We'll just take the department because that's what we need, and we'll also disable the prefix. Hit OK. Now that gives us the department the exact same way that it relationship does from the model view. Another way that you can combine your data is using append. Append doesn't work sideways, but more like an addition to your current query. So for example, let's add a new query here just to demonstrate to you what I mean. So let's hit new source, and I prepared another one. So for example, it's a new list of employees for January 2020, and we want to combine this with the employees query that we have. It's the exact same file but with the same structure. So it has ID, name, and date of birth. We hit OK. We'll see that we now have that query on the left hand side. To combine this with the employees query, we'll need to go to the employees table, and instead of merging, we click the append queries instead. So let's hit that, and now let's look for the table that we want to connect it with. It's the employees, and hit OK. So what it does is it appends the new set of data that we have on the employees for January 2020, not sideways, but underneath this data in this query itself. So if I keep scrolling down, let's go to the very end of this. So we know we have about 1,000 at the beginning. So you'll see now that when we reach the end, you'll see that the January 2020 employees have been appended into the same query, but not in the right columns. And that's because the column names and the column types don't really match. So if we do the matching, so if we rename these to the same values that we have on the employees table, this should be appended correctly. So let's go back to the employees table and let's modify this a little bit to match our employees table. Name, date of birth, and let's also change this to a text. So now if we go back to the employees table, that should be done correctly. So now you'll see that there are no more new columns, and after we reach 1,000 here, which is the January 2020 employees, you will see that they have been added there in the same columns. The beauty of Power Query is that the steps that you do to transform and clean your data is abstracted through UI. It means you're able to transform your data into something that you can use into a report without having to know too much about the technical details of how it's done under the hood. However, there will be times where you will need to do some transformations in your data, and the option isn't available for you in the UI. Now, this is where the advanced editor comes in. When you hit advanced editor, this will show us a bunch of code, which is basically the code that runs your applied steps. Now, this is what's called the M language, and this is pretty much what drives the applied steps on the UI. By editing the values in this window, you're able to tap into more functions that normally isn't available in the UI itself on Power Query. So let me show you how you can use some simple manipulation here to make some changes in your Power Query. So you see here on the step called change type, we change a couple of columns called ID, name, and date of birth. and the ID specifically gets changed into an integer type. And we know that we need to change this into a text format because we have another change type here, which changes that into a text. But let's say we don't want to do two change type steps. Let's just do one. So from here, let's change this into a text. So let's type text. And you see that it also has its IntelliSense, but for now, let's just use text and hit done. Let's also remove the change type here. And let's go back to the error here. So let's see what we made, what is the problem. So here's the formula bar, which is just the line version of the advanced editor. So we see that we missed the type, which needs to go before the text itself. So let's type here. And when we hit enter, that should be it. So you'll see that now at the end of this applied steps, we have all of our columns and the employee ID is in the right data type. And that pretty much covers this section of the DA-100 exam. So what did you think? Was this any help to you? If you have any more questions or if there are anything that I didn't cover in this video, please let me know in the comment section below. Leave a like on this video if you enjoyed this content and you want me to keep making more. It's really the best way to let me know that you enjoy this type of content. Get in touch using the social media links that I included in the description box below. And thank you so much guys for watching. See you again on the next one.